Hi and welcome to a new episode on my RC Scrappy build. I'm Mark on RC Nerd 74. In today's video it's all about the belly modification on my RC Scrappy build. The plane is based on the Horizon Hobby 2.1 meter carbon cup. The target of this modification is to come closer to the round belly shape of the full-scale Scrappy built by Mike Patey. The stock belly of the Horizon carbon cup is completely flat, not a really round shape, so I've built this carbon part to get a way more round shape, to get way closer to the design of the original Scrappy. So in this video I guide you through all the steps in all the details, so let's jump right into the build steps. Because I wanted to modify the shape of the fuselage itself, I first did a test on the belly side of the fuselage if I can sand the foam, if there will be any issues sanding the foam, but that worked pretty well. And the reason why I had to sand the belly is that I had to do some slight modifications in the shape of the sides, and we go to the details of this later in this video. The stock shape of the Horizon Hobby carbon cup has some sharp lines on the side of the fuselage. These lines are not on the fuselage of full-scale Scrappy, so the first step was to sand off the sharp lines on both sides of the fuselage. For this I used 240 grit sandpaper and a foamy sanding block to make the sanding surface as smooth as possible. This worked pretty well. To sand the rear end, I removed the rods for the elevator and rudder to get better access to the rear end, to sand off the sharp lines also on the rear end of the fuselage. Next step was to sand the whole lower side, the bottom side of the stock belly, just to make it easier to work with the foam I put it on it. And I also had to sand away the step between the plastic part for the suspension mount and the foam part of the fuselage, just to get a perfect aligned surface for better fitting of the foam template I later put on the fuselage. First sanding try was with sanding paper, but it didn't work out. The plastic was way too hard, so I used my Dremel tool to sand down the plastic part to the same level of the foam part of the belly. Next step was to take the shape of the fuselage. For this I took a carton, put it on the fuselage, draw the lines. So I had the raw shape I used for the XPS foam, which I used to build the template for the carbon fiber part. Then I cut down the XPS foam to the raw shape. Then I had the issue that the stock belly is slightly round and the XPS plate was completely flat, so it wobbled around on the fuselage. So I had to do a hollow shape into the XPS foam. For this I tried to sand the hollow shape, but that didn't work out. It was way too time intense. So I took my hobby knife and cut it an angle into the XPS foam to make the perfect fit on the slightly round fuselage. This didn't look good at all, but that doesn't matter because it's just the inside of the template. Only important part is the round shape on top of the XPS plate, so don't care about the bad finish of the hollow shape of the XPS plate. Then I sanded the ends of the XPS foam to the exact right angle, so they will fit at the front and the rear end. Then I had the idea to get a perfect symmetrical fit, or to support the perfect symmetrical fit, to build carton templates which give the round shape on both sides, the exact same round shape on both sides, so I can lay them over the XPS foam and check if I sanded the foam in a perfect symmetrical shape. But later, during sanding the XPS foam, I figured out that this was absolutely not necessary. I sanded the whole XPS plate by hand and shape was pretty symmetrical, so no need for any templates to get a better shape. To make sanding of the raw XPS plate easier, I did the raw sanding of the fuselage, tried to go as close as possible to the final shape. During sanding process, I also took the final shape of the fuselage and marked it on the XPS foam, cut it down the sides of the XPS foam again, slightly narrower. This was also because I also sanded the lower area of the fuselage already a little bit round, just because the belly part is not high enough to get the similar round shape like full-scale scrappy. So I also sanded the side walls of the fuselage a little bit round, so I had a similar shape like full-scale scrappy. Then I did the final raw sanding with 80 grit sandpaper. 80 grit worked absolutely perfect. You can just slowly pull the sandpaper over the foam and you can really pull off layer by layer of the foam and you get a really nice shape and a really quick result. For the front end of the round belly shape, I had to do a separate foam part just because of the slight angle the fuselage has in this area. I had to do a separate part, also with XPS foam, sanded it, shaped it, cut it to the right shape, and glued the big part and the small part together with UHU Por to get one piece which fits the fuselage perfectly, just right to the rear double wishbone suspension mount. After gluing the parts together, I sanded the front end part to the right shape. Then I cleaned off the bottom side of the fuselage and then it was time to glue the template onto the fuselage. To make it possible to remove the template after making the carbon part, I used UHU Por and just did a few little drops on the fuselage to make it easier to pull off the template after the whole carbon part was made. That worked pretty perfect in the end, and you can see only these little spots here where the UHU glue was, but this will be covered later by the carbon part. After UHU Por was cured, I sanded the fuselage and the template to a perfect shape, so I had a seamless line between the fuselage and the XPS foam. Then it was time to prepare the fuselage for laminating it with carbon. First I had to cover the whole fuselage with Vaseline. Before I was able to do this, I had to protect the foam part of the fuselage with masking tape, just to avoid getting Vaseline into the foam, which will be tricky to clean up. So covered the whole side, both sides with tape, covered the belly with Vaseline, then prepared the carbon fiber, cut the carbon fiber part to put it over the round shaped belly and made sure that the carbon fiber laid perfectly clean and even all over the belly. Then I soaked up the whole carbon part with 24-hour epoxy. This was the first try making or putting the epoxy onto the part by hand, just for the reason because I have the better feeling of how I do pressure on the carbon fiber to avoid any accidentally moving around of the carbon fiber. And the job went out pretty well. The result was pretty even layer of epoxy on the carbon fiber. So I think for future carbon fiber projects I will put on the epoxy onto the carbon fiber always by hand, just wearing thin rubber gloves. The kind of carbon fiber I used for this part is a new one, which surprisingly had a loose fit of the waves of the carbon, so there were little gaps between all the waves. And after adding the epoxy, the waves closed the holes more or less, but some actually didn't close perfect. So what I will do later to have a perfect black surface, I will paint the carbon fiber parts from the inside just to avoid any visible bright spots of these little gaps between the carbon waves. For further carbon parts, which I will make with the same carbon fiber, I will push the carbon fiber to a diagonal shape. That will help to close the carbon fiber wave gaps better. So I hope to be able to avoid such little gaps on the carbon parts. I hope that on the final RC Scrappy design I can keep some visible areas of the carbon parts. This depends on how the finished carbon parts will look like. Perhaps I will wrap them with foil, but the target is to not wrap them with foil to make all the pure carbon visible on the final build. After the epoxy was completely cured, it was time to try to remove the raw carbon part from the fuselage, and I was absolutely happy how easy it was possible to take it off. Just on the front end with a little more complex shape. It was a little tricky to remove it, but no big deal. It came off pretty well. And I'm really happy with the final result, but this was not the shape I first wanted to have, so there were a few more steps I did to come to this final shape. First step to the final shape was to cut off the loose carbon fiber with a scissor. Then I had to clean out the whole carbon part inner side from the Vaseline. For this I used some dishwash liquid, but this was a really hard job to get off all the Vaseline. So there are for sure better solutions than Vaseline to build these carbon parts, which are easier to clean, or you don't have to clean at all. But the reason why I used Vaseline is just because it was laying around and I gave it a try, and except of more work on cleaning, the Vaseline solution works really great. First I wanted to reach a round sideline of the carbon part, so this would be a shape like this, but I put the carbon part on the scale and it showed around almost 100 grams, and I thought this is really too much weight, so I decided to go for a smaller, lighter part which has a straight line on the sidewall, and it actually, in my opinion, also looks a little better than the round shaped carbon I wanted to do first. So I went through these two steps. First sanded all the shape for the round edges, and then decided to cut off more carbon to get the flat line. For these two steps I always took some masking tape, masked the sidewall, marked the line where I wanted to cut the carbon, cutted the carbon all around, front end, rear end, cutted the side edges and sanded all the edges to a smooth finish. But in the end I'm really happy to have the straight line, and also was able to reduce the weight from almost 100 grams to currently around 65 grams. So currently the carbon belly overlaps the fuselage on around 1.5 centimeters on each side. So this is definitely enough to get a strong glued connection between the carbon part and the foam fuselage itself. And then the next target was to eliminate the step you have between the carbon fiber part and the foam fuselage. I wanted to have an absolute seamless line between the foam and the carbon, and for this I had to do a step into the foam. So I first had to draw the line where the carbon fiber ends on the fuselage on both sides, And then I also used again 60 grit sandpaper to sand down the sidewall of the fuselage just a little bit, just to make it possible to drop the carbon slightly into the fuselage to get a really nice smooth overlap of the carbon part on the foam. For the front end, where the fuselage is made of plastic, I had to use again my Dremel tool just because of the hard, strong plastic. And with the Dremel tool I was able to also get a perfect shape. So the carbon part now finally fits really in a clean shape. At the end you have no step at all between the fuselage and the carbon part. Then I also made the carbon cover, which will later cover the whole suspension mount. The idea is that this part will stay removable, and the reason for this is to make it possible to do any kind of modification on the double wishbone suspension. So I can screw off the double wishbone suspension mounts, I can take off the whole suspension, do any modifications later. Also, when Scrappy is completely built and finished, I'm still able to do any handling I need on the double wishbone suspension, because this is really experimental and I cannot tell if this will work perfectly like it is now, or perhaps I can remove some weight because it's too heavy and too strong. So we will see if there will be any need for any modifications, but with a removable part it will be easy to do any modifications on the already installed suspension. To make this part I had to do the whole same steps, do the foam part, put Vaseline all over it, cover it with carbon fiber, put the epoxy on it, cured it and cut it to the raw shape. This is just the raw shape. Now I have to do a lot of finishing work and adding a second layer because it's pretty flexible still. So I think I will do on both ends, front and rear end, a second layer just to make it stronger. Same for the big belly part, just because you can see the one layer carbon part is wobbling around. So I want to strengthen up this line, and also the rear end I want to strengthen with a second layer, just 1 or 2 centimeters inside the part to make the whole construction a little stiffer. So next steps will be the reinforcement of both carbon parts, the finishing of the shape of the suspension cover, and the final installation of the belly part onto the fuselage. I will also try to remove some weight from the lower belly to avoid to have too much additional weight because of the carbon part I add. So perhaps I will drill a bunch of holes into the bottom side to go as close as possible to the stock weight of the fuselage. So this was it for today's video. I'm really happy with the progress so far. I'm pretty excited to finish the whole belly. So thanks a lot for watching. Have a good time. See you in the next one. Bye bye.